G'day YouTube, Necroarcana6 here with the next part of Strange Unsolved Mysteries by Margaret Ronan, Chapter 8, When Abraham Lincoln Spoke with Spooks. I just need a quick drink before we start because I forgot to take one before starting the bloody recording. This next chapter's a little bit longer than the others, so need all the help I can get. Anyway, in the Library of Congress in Washington DC, these words are a matter of record. For more than an hour I was made to talk with Mr. Lincoln. I learned from my friends afterward that it was upon matters he seemed fully to understand, but I comprehended very little until the portion was reached that related to the forthcoming Emancipation Proclamation. The words are those of Nettie Colburn, the so-called child medium, who became famous as a psychic in Washington DC. In the mid-1800s, many Washingtonians came to watch Nettie go into trances, during which she believed to be talking with spirits. Among the spectators was Mary Todd Lincoln, wife of the President of the United States. Mrs. Lincoln was worried about her husband. The President was bowed down by the defeats of Union troops in 1862, and by the controversy over his plans for an Emancipation Proclamation. Perhaps, thought Mrs. Lincoln, Nettie Colburn could offer the President comfort and advice. In December 1862, Mrs. Lincoln invited Nettie to come to the Red Parlour in the White House. The President stood before me, Nettie recalled later, with a smile on his face. Dropping his hand upon my head, he said in a humorous tone, "So this is our little Nettie that we have heard so much about." Nettie was then seated in a high-backed chair, her eyes closed, and she slipped into a deep trance. There was silence for a time, then she began to speak. But the voice that came from her lips was a man's, rich and deep. "The war will never cease, and shouts of victory will never ring through the North until you issue a proclamation that shall set free the enslaved millions of your unhappy country," said the voice. There was a breathless pause, and then the voice continued. "Stand firm upon your convictions. It is your duty to fearlessly perform the work, and fulfill the mission for which you have been raised up by Providence. Do not compromise the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation. You must not delay the enforcement of the proclamation beyond the first of the year." When Nettie regained consciousness, she found herself surrounded by grave faces. Dazed, she knew nothing that had happened during her trance. She saw the President looking at her with a strained expression. "Did the voice we heard not have a familiar sound to you, sir?" asked one of the men present. The President nodded and glanced at the portrait of Daniel Webster hanging on the wall. "Yes, and it is very singular," he said thoughtfully. "Miss Colburn, you have a remarkable gift." Abraham Lincoln seemed to take seriously the advice he received at Nettie's seance. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. Later, when Nettie's spirit voices advised him to improve the morale of the soldiers by visiting their camps, he did so. Nettie was not the only medium that the President consulted during the anguish of the Civil War. He also invited a medium named J.B. Conklin to conduct seances at the White House on 4 succeeding Sundays. Mr. Conklin not only served up messages from the spirit world, but according to witnesses, he also caused a piano to rise several inches from the floor by itself, even though several spectators tried to hold it down. Many people did not approve of the President's habit of holding seances at the White House. Newspapers often printed articles scolding Lincoln for speaking with spooks. But Lincoln paid no heed. Such articles, he felt, were written by people who could not begin to tell the wonderful things he has witnessed. Years later, Nettie Colburn wrote a book called Was Abraham Lincoln a Spiritualist? Like many people of his time, he seemed to have accepted the central teaching of spiritualism, that the spirit lives on after death. Mr. Lincoln was deeply interested in the great mysteries, Nettie wrote in answer to the question posed by the book's title. But because he never openly committed himself, it is impossible to say whether or not Mr. Lincoln was a spiritualist. Lincoln himself seemed to have been gifted with ESP. He had often had dreams that foretold the future. The most famous of these is on record, for he told it to many friends. There seemed to be a death-like stillness about me, he said. Then I heard sobs, as if people were weeping. I left my bed and wandered downstairs. The dead silence was broken by the same pitiful sobbing, but the mourners were invisible. I went from room to room, no living person was in sight, but as the same sound of distress met me as I passed along. It was light in older rooms. Every object was familiar to me, but where were older people who were grieving as if their hearts were broken? I was puzzled and alarmed. What could be the meaning of all this? Determined to find the cause of things so mysterious and so shocking, I kept on until I arrived at the east room, which I entered. There I met with a sickening surprise. Before me lay a corpse wrapped in funeral vestments. Acting around it were stationed soldiers, acting as guards. And there were a throng of people, some gazing upon the corpse, whose face was covered, while others were weeping pitifully. Who was dead in the White House? I demanded one of the soldiers. The President was his answer. He was killed by an assassin. Then came a loud burst of grief from the crowd, which awoke me from my dreams. I slept no more that night, and although it was only a dream, I've been anxious about it ever since. On April 7, 1865, 2 days before the Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant of the Union forces, Lincoln had another dream that troubled him greatly. I seemed to be on a deep, broad, rolling river. I was in a boat and I was falling in. On the next 2 nights, Lincoln had the same dream again. It left him depressed and anxious. On the morning of his death, he told Senator Charles Sumner, "I know something extraordinary is about to happen, and very soon." That night, as he sat with his wife in Ford's Theatre, Lincoln was shot to death by John Wilkes Booth. His dreams of impending doom had come true, but this is not the end of the story. Although the great emancipator has been dead for over 100 years, many people say his ghost still haunts the White House. According to one report, he paid a courtesy call while Queen Wilhelmina of Holland visited President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the Executive Mansion. The Queen heard a knock at the door of her suite, and when she opened it, there stood Lincoln, smiling upon her with a twinkle in his eyes. And then he was gone. But not before she got the impression that the 16th US President was indeed in the best of spirits. And that is the end of that chapter. God, my throat is red raw because I've been reading non-stop for the last hour. Anyway, let me know what you think down in the comments below. Did Abraham Lincoln really talk to ghosts? Until next time, this is NecroCast X Triple I signing off. Good night YouTube, and stay classy.